Okay, everyone, we are going to get started. Again, thank you for joining us today for this installment of the Voluntary Benefit Shops webinar series, broker webinar series. My name is Mike Walker from the president of the Voluntary Benefit Shop, and today we're um, going to be talking about legislative updates for long-term care and state legislative updates for long-term care, and then some innovative solutions to long-term care as well. Um, we are very lucky today to have Kevin Morris from the government relations lead from Trustmark joining us. He was just sharing with us some of his past history, and he's it sounds like he's very, very in tune to what's going on in our government legislative bodies and in general and specifically with this life with or with this LTC kind of wave of potential legislation that's out there right now. So we'll get started with that in just a second. Before we do, please know that you can ask questions into our chat. And we'll get to the questions, at the end. Today's presentation will be probably about 20 minutes, 25 minutes with some opportunity for us to get to questions at the end. So with that said, let me just give you a little bit of commercial on the Voluntary Benefit Shop. I think most of you are probably familiar with who we are. But what we do here at the Voluntary Benefit Shop is we help brokers like yourselves bring voluntary benefit solutions, the best in voluntary benefit solutions to their employer clients. And that's what we do every day. We have a really significant focus on the life with long-term care type of products that we'll spend a little bit of time talking about today, the products such as the ones that Trustmark brings to market. And we do, many cases with those types of products. So if you're interested in finding out more about those type of products or voluntary benefits in general, please reach out to us. You can see my contact information here as well as our website. And so we look forward to hearing from some of you that maybe we haven't heard from in the past. With that said, I'm going to get ready to turn it over to Kevin. But first, Kevin, I just want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. I know you're busy and you're in your everyday job with Trustmark, especially with trying to keep up with all the stuff that's going on with these with the legislative updates that are going on out there. So, with that said, Kevin, again, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you to kind of get started.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mike, and good morning. Really appreciate the opportunity to join the VB shop and your partners. It's a real pleasure. As I mentioned to Mike just a few minutes ago, I had the privilege to join the Trustmark team last March to lead government relations. And prior to joining Trustmark, I'd spent the vast majority of my career in the government relations, public affairs space, leading government relations in the beverage and the packaging industry. And before that, working in government on Capitol Hill and political campaigns throughout my life. So I'm passionate about this. I love it. I love advocating on behalf of business. And it's especially a pleasure to be working on such an important issue within insurance, long-term care. It's such a critical issue, for our country that we face and for the states. And so, it's just a real, pleasure for me to have that opportunity to work on behalf of Trustmark and on such an important issue to, actually do some good. And so today we'll, spend a few minutes just talking about the legislative process, kind of the political environment, across the country, because that's really important. I think for those of you that have kind of followed the legislative process, it's not a straight line. On a chart it might look that way, but in reality, how a bill becomes law can very, very, quite differently from state to state, city to city. And so it's important that you kind of understand the nuances from state to state and realize that just because a bill has been introduced doesn't mean it's going to become law, right? It's a long journey, through a House, through a Senate, a governor. So it's a long journey. So just to kind of set the expectations, especially on significant public policy issues like long-term care that that require significant funding and involvement, that those kinds of issues especially take a long time. And I think it's helpful to kind of reflect on, we had the midterm elections this last November. And there were some interesting, kind of results and changes, especially at the state and the local level. And this map shows states that have what we call trifectas. So states with a governor, the House, and the Senate, which are all controlled by the same party. The states in blue, I'm sure everyone knows, those are controlled by the Democrats, or in Minnesota's case, they call it the DFL. And those in red are the Republicans, and those in gray, it's a mix, it's a balance. It could be a governor and a Republican or Democratic legislature, or a combination of the above. So after last November, I think what's kind of significant to think about, Minnesota, Michigan, Massachusetts, and Maryland became Democratic trifectas. Like Minnesota and Michigan were kind of a surprise, frankly. Their legislatures hadn't been all Democratic in quite some time. And why this is important, obviously, philosophically, politically, Democratic states, Republican states, balanced states, maybe going to look at issues a little bit differently. And the political climate in a Democratic state might, portend, more receptivity to more significant public policy or, programs such as long-term care than Republicans, which have more of a free market approach in general. Not always, that's not always the case, but I think it's just kind of helpful to kind of think about this, look at this map, and kind of what has happened. We do have very much a divided country. Just anecdotally in Minnesota this year, I was reading in January, since they became a trifecta, their session started right after the first of the year. They've passed more bills in January of this year than in January of the past 6 sessions combined. So you can see what can happen when you have parties, controlled by the same party. So they're obviously, agreeing on virtually everything, and the business community, unfortunately, is getting maybe the short end of the stick in Minnesota, right now, this year, if you talk to folks in that space. So just to kind of set the stage, here's kind of a look at the country politically. And once again, just keep in mind, legislation in general, can take time. There are situations where things can move more quickly. Obviously, within a trifecta, that's the case. So if you want to go to the next slide, Mike. This is a map. This is our kind of view of where long-term activity is most prevalent. And the states shaded in yellow are states where either legislation had been introduced in the 2021-2022 legislative session, or something has been introduced either legislatively or regulatory-wise activity within a department this year. So if you go to the next slide, I guess this is your kind of, actually, let's go back to the, go back to the previous map, Mike. I'll just kind of briefly talk through where things are. So in 2021-2022, bills were introduced in Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and New York. So we already had bills in place, law had passed in Washington, a task force up and running in California. But in 2021-2022, we had bills introduced in Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and New York. Minnesota's bill was a strictly public program. There was no opportunity for private insurance to play a role. The bill was never even heard in the House. And frankly, that member ran for Congress in the primary, lost, and so she's not returning to the Minnesota legislature. So that bill died, does not come back. In Pennsylvania and New York, I know we'll talk a little bit more about those later, but bills were introduced, weren't even heard and died. But this year, just to kind of be aware, recently activity in Massachusetts, there is a bill draft in the House that would establish a commission to consider a statewide public long-term care program. And in Minnesota, the Department of Human Services issued an RFP, and they actually are bringing in a consultant to look at funding long-term care overall. And so that consultant, I understand, has been selected. I don't know if it's been announced, but they will have a kind of a hard deadline to get back to the Department of Human Services their perspective on funding long-term care by June, which could then trigger some discussion. But nothing has been introduced thus far in Minnesota this year. But in Massachusetts, we have this bill draft, which once they return in session at the end of February, will be introduced, and I would expect that there will be a commission in play in Massachusetts. Washington, we know the bill was passed. A commission was established, LTSS Commission. They met throughout the last year and a half, provided a report and recommendations to the legislature in December. The legislature has not taken action on any of those recommendations, and frankly, we're not expecting any legislative activity to change walk carriers before it goes into effect in July of this year. And then California, of course, which had the Long-Term Care Commission, they developed a report with five program designs to the legislature. But now what's going to occur is a actuarial subcommittee will start meeting. Actually, their first meeting is next week on the 27th to help develop a kind of a cost estimate for each of the five designs. So I guess you could kind of move on from this map, Mike. I know we'll talk a little bit more.
And Kevin, I'll give a little bit of an update.
Sure.
Here. So for some of you maybe aren't familiar with what happened in Washington State, and so I'll give you a little bit of a recap of that, and also talk to you a little bit about what happened there from a sales perspective in Washington State as well. So Washington State, and Kevin, if I misspeak on anything here, be sure to correct me. But Washington State initially was the first state to look at this type of legislation, and they enacted something that was originally it established a payroll tax on employees, not on employers, but on employees. And it was set for that tax to begin originally January 1st of 2022. And there was some problems, some issues that people had with the tax. Number one, it's an unlimited tax. So the longer I work, the more I make, the more I pay into it. But at the same time, my lifetime maximum benefit was only $36,500, which for any of you that know long-term care know that that's a drop in the bucket in terms of total long-term care costs. The other thing is that it was also very possible for me to pay into that tax with the way it was originally structured for many, many years. And then let's say I move out of state and retire to California or Florida or Arizona or anywhere else. And then I needed the long-term care services. I may not be able to access it because I would have to live in the state of Washington at the time that I needed to access the care. Or even I might live in Oregon, drive across the border into Washington and work in Washington. I have to pay the tax, but because I live in Oregon, I'm not going to have access to it either because, again, I have to live in the state of Washington to be able to access the tax. So those were all things that were problematic. But now what the state of Washington did do that really spurred a lot of interest from the insurance community was that the state of Washington allowed people to have the ability to opt out of the tax if they could demonstrate that they had a long-term care, approved long-term care type of product in place. And that plan had to be in place by November 1st or October 31st, I should correctly say, of October 31st of 2021. Okay, had to be in place by then. And so the end result was you had thousands of companies in the state of Washington trying to find a solution that would allow their employees to have the opportunity to opt out of the tax. And we, at the VB shop, we helped many, many companies bring that solution or bring a solution to their employees. Trustmark being, having a product that was one of those solutions. And so we help many states do that. And so, or many companies do that. And so, as Kevin is alluded to, states kind of, they're copycat states, right? Like one state does something, then other states start to look at similar types of things. And so that's where a lot of this legislation has started to come from. Is states trying to look at what Washington did and either emulate something similar or maybe improve upon it. But that's what started a lot of the conversations. So with that, Kevin, I'll move forward, and you can certainly correct me or anything that you want to do. Well,
first, before we go off Washington, Mike, you help keep me, straight. But it's my understanding that, the legislature, really the state really didn't engage the industry and bring them to the table when it was being put together and passed. So you had all these issues, right? Once
correct.
it was passed and had to be dealt with, such as, recertification and certification, et cetera. And then they created this commission, which included some legislators, which met for over a year and a half and developed a series of recommendations, including the need to codify recertification, because right now a policyholder, after July 1st, there's no requirement for them to maintain, their policy, if they've received the exemption and certification. So,
Sure.
uh, um,
Correct.
so unfortunately, right now the legislative leadership is not interested in opening the whole, topic up, because a bill was introduced to repeal walk cares. There's been other bills introduced, but it doesn't look like they're going to address, any of those issues in Washington this session. But stay tuned. They end in April. We're certainly going to look towards 2024 to hopefully make those changes. I know that the Association of Washington Businesses, which represent many of the firms that you represented, during the process, was circulating a letter to, encourage the governor and the legislature to adopt those changes or to consider pausing the program. So, which I don't think will happen either. But so a lot going on in Washington state for sure.
Sure. Well, we'll talk about some of the other states now, Kevin, that are also considering. So we can maybe start with, a little bit, maybe a little more detail about what they're looking at in California.
Yeah, so California established this commission through the Department of Insurance, which included, actually, fortunately, two actuaries from the industry were part of it, along with other stakeholders, which were primarily people from, government or AARP, et cetera. So they had certainly a perspective of their own. But they met for over a year and a half, came back with and decided on sharing 5 program designs, from something very similar to Washington state to a very rich program. So a payroll tax that would require a payroll tax similar to Washington, to, from 0.58% to over 2.5 or 3%, payroll tax. Very, very significant cost. So the next phase, after the report was completed, there will be this actuarial subcommittee review process, which starts next week. So they have their first meeting. So members from within that same task force, I think the same 2 actuaries from the industry are part of that. So they'll have three meetings this year. They'll share their findings with the task force overall, who could then make changes to those very same designs that they had submitted previously. And then they have to provide the full, report to the legislature by the end of next year. Thus far, no legislator has expressed an interest in introducing a bill as yet. Of course, I think they want to see how much is this going to cost. I know there was a conference that I attended in the fall, our state trade association held, and there were several legislators there, and there was a presentation of the 5 program designs. And the legislators that were there are those that were very much active in the insurance issue in area, in committees and leadership. They really weren't following the task force and what they were looking at, and were frankly very, very surprised at the overall cost and concern. So they were like, "Oh my goodness, this is a big lift." So I think it's going to be a while in California before we see legislation potentially. I think they're going to want to really understand the cost implications. California went from a forecast of $100 billion surplus last year as a state to a deficit this year between $25 and $50 billion in the course of 1 year. So they're going to be very careful at any kind of new program. So the task force kind of did their first pass. Now the actuaries are going to kind of put a price tag to it, come back, and then they'll provide the final report by the end of this year.
Kevin, let's talk a little bit about a couple states that are maybe a little closer to
Sure.
To home for a lot of these people on the call. We can talk a little bit about New York and then Pennsylvania. So why don't we start with New York?
Sure. In New York, State Senator Shelley Mayer from Yonkers introduced the Long-Term Care Trust Act, which is very similar to Washington, as Mike alluded to, that it was almost copy and paste. but it did not account for or allow for the kind of products that Trustmark sells as a private option. But what I think is interesting to note is that Senator Meyer, the reason that she became interested in the issue is that she was hearing from constituents who had standalone long-term care policies and were experiencing significant rate increases, 30, 40, 50, percent. She was hearing from them, looked into the issue, and that's what prompted her to introduce her bill in May of last year. Now, New York session goes 2021, 2022, ended in December. She introduced the bill very late in the process, in May, frankly, which is really pretty much the end of their session. So nothing happened, didn't even get heard. She has not reintroduced the bill yet this year. I just spoke to our trade association in New York on Tuesday, the Life Insurance Council of New York, and they have not heard from her whether she's planning to reintroduce. And if she does plan to, that we'll work with her to ensure that that hybrid products such as what Trustmark offers, are eligible if she does in fact move forward. But at this point, I would say it's less likely, or I would say, highly improbable that something would pass in New York, given how their session works on their budget process for this year. So we're staying very close to it. There could be, things can change, but right now it doesn't appear that Senator Mayer is focused on this issue. She's introduced, I think, 52 other bills so far, and this is not one of them yet. So as of this week, so.
Hey, Kevin, one of the things that I've heard about the proposed legislation in New York is that one of the big differences between Washington State and New York is Washington State had this kind of long ramp up period that gave people the opportunity to be able to get coverage in place so that they could opt out. And what I've heard about New York is that it's potentially where either the ramp up period is going to be very short, or they might even have it retro. So, for example, if they pass legislation next year, it might say that you had to have coverage in place by January 1st of the previous year, or January 1st of that year, in order to be able to opt out. In other words, people would have to plan ahead this year for potential legislation next year to be able to be in a position to be able to opt out. Have you heard similar type of things?
Well, the bill that she introduced, last year would have had an effective date of January 1st, 2023. But that was the bill she introduced last year. That died, and she has to reintroduce a whole new bill. So have not heard in terms of the timing that she would include. But the fact is that bill did die. So it's not, out there, that effective date is no longer really on the table at this point.
Okay. Well, appreciate that feedback. How about a little bit about Pennsylvania? That's close to a lot of us.
Yeah, so Pennsylvania literally was Washington Cares. So it was the exact same bill that was introduced very late in their session again, and only in the House, and it did not even receive a hearing, and it died because of the timing and has not been reintroduced. And we've heard nothing coming out of Pennsylvania, Mike, in terms of an interest to reintroduce. Legislators are very pragmatic. And if they don't, this is a very significant program, and if they don't feel that there's an interest, they're not as likely. But right now, we don't have any intelligence that indicates Pennsylvania is going to really seriously consider it this year.
A couple of other states I've heard about recently. Maine is one, and I think you touched on Maine before, but I was talking to someone that mentioned that many times Maine kind of follows what Washington State does. It sounded like Washington State put in an FMLA program that then Maine very much closely followed. So is Maine, I know you touched on them a little bit, but are they in the mix for something to potentially get more serious?
I've not heard about Maine, Mike, and I'd love to hear more from where you've heard that. But Massachusetts was the state I mentioned.
Okay.
That there's going to be likely a commission similar to the California commission.
Yeah.
That could
sounds good. I was talking to somebody that's pretty politically connected in Maine, and it was specifically Maine I heard about. I also I know another. Have you heard anything about Virginia? Because Virginia is another state that I heard recently that there was some rumblings in, and I was wondering whether you had heard anything about Virginia.
No, I honestly, have not,
Okay,
either
good.
from the, ACLI or other sources, but I'll certainly kind of ask
Okay. Well, I
and would love
appreciate
to.
that. And guys, I know we're coming up on time, so and I know we want to be able to take your questions as well. But I did want to just touch on a couple of things. So really, the solution that many cases used in Washington State were what are called life with long-term care hybrid products. And for those of you that aren't familiar with those are a product that combines the benefits of life insurance along with long-term care, all into one program. And people do, tend to like the hybrid products, and just in general the way that they work. This screen here gives you a pretty good idea of how they work. They have a death benefit. So if someone happens to, if they pass away, they never need long-term care. Let's say I have a heart attack on the golf course, I never need long-term care. It's going to pay me a benefit just like any other life insurance would. The programs also have a terminal illness component, which will work very much like a basic life, terminal illness component. I can get 75% of my death benefit right away if I'm diagnosed with a terminal illness. That may vary a little bit by carrier, but in general, 75%. And then in terms of long-term care, it's going to generally pay me 4% of whatever my death benefit is each month for up to 25 months of receiving that benefit. So in a case where I have $100,000 worth of coverage, 4% would of course be $4,000 per month. After 25 months, typically, depending on the state and carrier, an extension of benefits kicks in, which will extend that LTC benefit for another 25 months. And then after 25 months, or I'm sorry, for a total of 50 months. And then again, many times, depending upon the carrier and the state, there may also be death benefit restoration. So even if I exhaust all 50 months of long-term care and then pass away, I may have a death benefit restoration so that my beneficiaries still receive that full death benefit of $100,000. So you can see, kind of in a worst case scenario with this type of product, you could, let's say I had $100,000 in coverage, I could receive $200,000 in long-term care benefits and $100,000 in death benefits. So a total, payout in a worst case scenario of $300,000, where I have 50 months of long-term care and then I pass away. Now, again, that product structure is going to vary by carrier and state and things of that nature, but just to kind of give you a general idea of how it works. One of the other appeals of the product as well, and then we'll wrap this up, is that it's typically a guaranteed issue product. And so, in general, this is the type of underwriting offer that we're getting, for your typical small to medium sized case, 100,000 of guaranteed issue for the employee. And then they can typically get more than that with just answering a few health questions. And again, those limits depend on the carrier and the group and things of that nature. But this is just to kind of give you a general idea of how, those underwriting offers work. We're right up on time, so I'm going to stop now, see if anybody has any questions that they want to, enter into chat. And then we can wrap up from there. Chelsea, are there any questions in chat?
As of right now, no.
Guys, feel free to go ahead and enter any questions that you might have into chat, and then Kevin, I'll let you go ahead and bring up whatever you want to bring up.
Sure. While people are potentially thinking about questions, just to really encourage everyone to get involved locally. Get to know who your state representative, your state senator is. It's very easy going on the state website to look up, I think every state, you just input your home address and you can find who your state rep and senator are. Look for opportunities to meet them locally, not when you need something, but if they're having a town hall or coffees or some kind of meeting where you can introduce yourself, tell them what you do. You'll become a resource, and you may agree with them politically, you may not, but it's really critical that you have that relationship and find ways to bring others as well, because if we don't have those relationships and an issue comes up, it's too late, right? But if they know you, they trust you, they're going to listen much more carefully. So get involved in your trade associations. Mike and I were talking about the PACs for different, trade groups, NAFA, et cetera. Please get involved. And then just, mention, Mike, there's a best interest regulatory and legislative issue that has now emerged in California as of last Friday, which I'm sure a lot of your folks would be concerned about. So just to kind of FYI.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Again, I do want to remind you we have an upcoming one of our next monthly webinar series. We're going to be talking specifically more about the Life with Long-Term Care product and give you some updates because Trustmark has a new version. Some of the other carriers have new versions as well, so we'll be giving you some updates on those. In the meantime, if you have any questions about these types of products or want proposals for clients or want to talk a little bit more about how these products work, we're a resource. Feel free to reach out to us. Here's my contact information again. You have my phone number. You have my email. You have our website. Please feel free to reach out. And again, I'll open it up and just see if there's any other questions.
And Mike, the group, please feel free to reach out to me. Get my contact information from Mike. And of course, Trustmark looks forward to working with all of you and your clients on cases going forward. So really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate you today. Thanks for taking the time with us. Chelsea, any questions in chat for us?
There are not, no.
Okay. Well, hey, everyone, again, really appreciate your time today. Thanks for being with us. We do have this recorded, so if you wanted a copy of the recording, feel free to get that. And then, again, reach out to us if you have any questions or need anything. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.